If anyone finds out what I do after midnight, they will call me a traitor before they ever ask why. Those words stopped me cold. I had not meant to hear them. I definitely had not meant to be standing outside the private chambers of the Imperial Princess when she whispered them to herself. My name is Nathan Brooks, and 3 months earlier I had traded my Marine Corps retirement for the quietest maintenance contract anyone could imagine. The Ilarian Royal Palace did not need soldiers. It needed technicians willing to crawl through ventilation shafts, repair ancient climate systems, and keep a 1,000-year-old palace from falling apart. It was supposed to be easy money. No firefights, no impossible missions, just tools, wiring, and long shifts. That night started like every other. My tablet flashed a Level 2 environmental alert from the royal quarters. According to the palace network, one of the atmospheric regulators had dropped below safe operating pressure. Normally, another crew would have handled it, but everyone else had already clocked out. I grabbed my toolbox, muttered, "Lucky me," and headed down a hallway that most employees never even saw. Royal quarters were off-limits unless you had written authorization. I had an emergency work order, so security waved me through without asking many questions. The farther I walked, the quieter everything became. The marble floors reflected soft blue lights from crystal fixtures overhead. Every footstep echoed just enough to remind me I did not belong there. I found the maintenance panel exactly where the blueprint said it would be, hidden behind an enormous carved doorway that led into the princess's private residence. The pressure reading still looked wrong. Probably another bad sensor, I mumbled as I removed the cover. But before I could reconnect the line, the warning light disappeared. The system had somehow fixed itself. I frowned. That makes no sense. Curious, I reached for the door, expecting it to be locked. Instead, it eased open by barely an inch. I should have walked away. Every instinct I had from the Marines told me to back out and pretend none of this had happened. Instead, I looked inside. Princess Lyra stood alone beneath a ceiling filled with glowing constellations. She wore no royal robes, no jeweled crown, no symbols of authority. She looked smaller somehow, almost like the weight of the palace had disappeared with the crown sitting quietly on a nearby table. In front of her rested an ancient metallic structure covered in symbols I had never seen before. She placed both hands against it and closed her eyes. The room filled with a soft pulse of silver light. Then I heard her voice again, barely louder than a whisper. "Just one more night. Please hold together." There was fear in her voice. Real fear. Not the kind politicians fake in front of cameras. The kind that comes from carrying something alone for far too long. I took one careful step backward, hoping to disappear before she noticed me. My boot brushed against the edge of my toolbox with a quiet click. Her eyes opened instantly. Bright silver met mine across the room. Neither of us moved. My stomach dropped. I had accidentally seen something no outsider was ever supposed to witness. I lifted both hands. "Your Highness, I can explain." She stared at me for another long second before quietly saying the last words I expected to hear. "No, Mr. Brooks. I think I am the one who owes you an explanation." Princess Lyra did not raise an alarm. She did not call for guards or demand to know how I had entered her chambers. Instead, she walked toward the small table, picked up the silver crown with both hands, and carefully placed it back on her head. The change was almost unsettling. In the space of 2 seconds, the frightened young woman I had accidentally interrupted disappeared behind the calm expression every news broadcast in the galaxy recognized. She looked at me with quiet composure. "Please close the door, Mr. Brooks." I hesitated. Every survival instinct I had told me this conversation could end my contract, or worse. But there was something in her voice that reminded me of commanders I had trusted years ago. They never shouted when the situation was serious. They became quieter. I gently shut the door behind me. "I am sorry," I said. "The maintenance system reported an environmental failure. I was responding to the work order. I did not mean to interrupt." She nodded once. "I know. I created the alert." I blinked. "You what?" It was the only way I could bring someone here without attracting suspicion. That answer raised more questions than it solved. "Your Highness, if you needed palace engineers, there are hundreds of them." "Not engineers," she replied. "A human." I stared at her, trying to decide whether I had misunderstood the translator. "Why me?" She stepped toward the ancient device resting in the center of the room. Up close, I could see faint lines of silver light moving beneath its surface like slow currents beneath frozen water. Because every person born inside this palace already belongs to someone. Every guard reports to a commander. Every servant answers to a supervisor. Every advisor serves a political family. You are the only outsider who repairs things instead of chasing power. I laughed awkwardly. That is probably the nicest thing anyone has ever said about maintenance work. For the first time, a small smile crossed her face. It disappeared almost immediately. Nathan, what I am about to tell you cannot leave this room. Her tone changed again, becoming almost painfully sincere. Every night, I must stabilize this ancient core. If I fail, or if someone interrupts the process for too long, something beneath this palace will begin to awaken. I folded my arms. You are telling me the fate of the Imperial Palace depends on one person showing up every night. Not the palace. She looked directly into my eyes. Millions of lives. I wanted to believe she was exaggerating. It sounded impossible. Governments did not trust one person with that kind of responsibility. They built backups, layers of protection, redundant systems. That was how responsible organizations worked. Then why does nobody else know? I asked. She looked toward the enormous windows overlooking the city. Because the people who should know are the very people trying to make sure I never complete the ritual again. The room suddenly felt colder. Before I could ask another question, the lights flickered once. The silver lines inside the ancient device dimmed for a brief second before glowing again. Princess Lyra quietly closed her eyes as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she whispered, almost to herself, "They are watching." I instinctively looked toward the ceiling. Hidden inside an ornamental archway, barely visible unless someone knew where to look, a tiny surveillance lens rotated almost silently before pointing directly at us. Without changing her expression, Lyra spoke under her breath. "Do not react. If they believe you know nothing, you might still be able to leave this room alive." Nobody said another word until the surveillance lens slowly turned away. I kept my eyes on the polished stone floor exactly the way Lyra had instructed. A few seconds later, the tiny indicator light beside the hidden camera faded from blue to black. She released a quiet breath that sounded as though she had been holding it for a long time. "It only watches in short cycles during the night," she said softly. "We have maybe 3 minutes." I looked back at the strange device in the middle of the room. "You live like this every day?" She answered with a tired smile. "Every day." Before I could respond, my work tablet chimed. The maintenance ticket had been automatically closed by the palace network. Someone somewhere had decided the emergency no longer existed. That should have made me feel relieved. Instead, it made my stomach tighten. Somebody had created the alert. Somebody had erased it. And apparently somebody had been watching the entire conversation. I picked up my toolbox. Maybe I should leave before I make things worse. Lyra nodded, but her expression suggested she wanted to say something else. Finally, she spoke. "Nathan, if anyone asks, you repaired an air circulation valve. Nothing more. I can do that. And whatever you think you saw tonight." She paused. "Forget it if you can." I gave a small shrug. I spent 20 years in the Marines. Forgetting things was never part of the job. For the first time, she actually laughed. It lasted only a second, but it sounded real. I stepped back into the hallway, letting the heavy door close behind me. The palace suddenly felt different. Earlier that evening it had seemed peaceful, almost beautiful. Now every decorative statue looked like it might be hiding another camera. Every guard seemed to be watching a little too carefully. As I walked toward the service elevator, 2 members of the Royal Guard approached from the opposite direction. Their polished armor reflected the hallway lights, and neither one acknowledged me until they were only a few feet away. The taller officer glanced at my identification badge. "Maintenance Technician Nathan Brooks?" "That is me." "Were you inside Her Highness's residence?" "Emergency climate control inspection." I held up the completed work order on my tablet. Everything checked out. The officer studied me for several uncomfortable seconds. "Did the princess say anything unusual?" My heartbeat picked up, but years of military life had taught me never to rush an answer. She thanked me for responding so late. The guard exchanged a quick look with his partner before giving a slow nod. "Very well. You may leave." I rode the elevator down to the engineering level, but something about that conversation refused to leave my mind. Those were not the questions of people protecting a princess. They never asked whether she was safe. They never asked if anything had happened inside the room. They only wanted to know what she had said. The next morning I tried convincing myself I was reading too much into it. Then, During my routine inspection of the palace power conduits, I noticed the same two guards standing outside a garden balcony where Princess Lyra was greeting schoolchildren visiting the palace. They never smiled. They never looked at the children. Their eyes stayed fixed on Lyra every second she moved. When she took 3 steps toward the balcony railing, one guard quietly reached for his communicator. When she stopped to speak with a little girl, the other subtly adjusted something on his wrist display. They were tracking her, not protecting her. Standing there with a wrench still in my hand, I realized something that refused to make sense. The safest person in the Empire was living under closer surveillance than any prisoner I had ever seen. The annual Founders' Reception transformed the Imperial Palace into something that looked more like a museum than the center of a government. Diplomats wandered beneath towering crystal arches. Military officers stood in perfectly organized rows. Musicians played softly in the background while reporters quietly documented every smile and every handshake. I spent the evening replacing a malfunctioning lighting relay hidden above the Grand Hall. It was exactly the kind of job that allowed me to stay invisible. That was how I preferred it. I was packing my tools when the room suddenly became silent. Princess Lyra entered through the eastern doors wearing formal royal attire, every movement graceful enough to satisfy centuries of tradition. The guests applauded politely. She smiled exactly as they expected. If I had not seen her alone the night before, I would have believed every second of it. From the balcony above, I noticed something else. The same Royal Guard officers who had questioned me earlier were not watching the crowd. They were watching her. One quietly spoke into a communicator. Another received a message and gave an almost invisible nod. It was coordinated, deliberate. My military instincts immediately recognized the pattern. It was not security coverage. It was containment. I climbed down from the maintenance platform just as the Master of Ceremonies announced an unexpected schedule change. Her Highness will now proceed to the Hall of Succession for a private emergency council. A faint ripple of confusion spread through the guests. Even Lyra looked surprised for half a second before recovering her composure. She turned toward the council corridor. The guards tightened their formation around her. Something felt wrong. I could not explain it logically. It was simply the same feeling I had experienced overseas seconds before an operation went sideways. My radio suddenly crackled. Maintenance Team 7. Report immediately to the West Utility Corridor. I looked down at the message. It had been sent from an account that no longer existed in the palace directory. Before I could investigate, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Nathan. I turned. Lyra had somehow fallen a few steps behind her escort. She did not look directly at me, keeping her smile fixed toward the crowd. Do not leave this floor. She continued walking without waiting for an answer. Less than 30 seconds later, the ceremonial doors to the Hall of Succession closed. Then every palace display screen flickered. The palace emblem disappeared, replaced by the seal of the Imperial Security Council. A cold voice echoed across the hall. By authority of the High Regency, Princess Lyra is hereby placed under immediate investigation for acts of treason against the Empire. The room exploded into whispers. Diplomats froze. Reporters stared at one another in disbelief. I looked toward the Royal Guard expecting confusion or protest. There was none. Almost every guard calmly turned toward the sealed council chamber as though they had been expecting this announcement all along. One officer raised his hand, and dozens of security drones quietly activated along the ceiling. My pulse quickened. This had been planned long before tonight. The enormous chamber doors slowly opened again. Lyra stepped back into the hall alone. She looked calm, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Behind her, members of the Regency Council remained seated in complete silence. The captain of the Royal Guard walked forward and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. Your Highness, for the safety of the Empire, please surrender your authority. Lyra answered with remarkable composure. I have betrayed no one. The captain's expression never changed. That is no longer your decision to make. As more guards quietly surrounded her from every direction, I realized the people sworn to protect the princess had just become the greatest threat she faced. For a few long seconds, nobody moved. The entire grand hall seemed frozen beneath the glittering chandeliers, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. I looked around the room expecting at least one officer to question the order. Nobody did. Every member of the Royal Guard simply tightened the circle around Princess Lyra. Their hands rested calmly on their equipment, not threatening, not panicked, just following instructions that had obviously been prepared long before tonight. My brain kept searching for a reasonable explanation. Maybe this was some elaborate constitutional procedure. Maybe the princess really was under investigation. But then I saw the look she gave me. It lasted less than a second. She did not look frightened for herself. She looked worried for me. That was what made my decision a lot harder than it should have been. One of the council officials stepped forward carrying a polished silver case. "Your Highness," he announced, "please surrender the imperial seal voluntarily." Lyra remained perfectly still. No lawful council has the authority to request it. The official smiled politely. That interpretation has changed. Around the room, reporters began whispering into their microphones while diplomats quietly backed away from the center floor. Nobody wanted to become part of whatever was unfolding. I should have followed them. I was a maintenance contractor. My job description definitely did not include constitutional crises inside an alien palace. Then I noticed something else. The captain of the royal guard made a subtle gesture with 2 fingers. Half of the guards shifted position, not toward the exits, but toward the princess herself. Years in the Marines had taught me to recognize coordinated movement. They were cutting off every possible escape route. This was never going to end with a conversation. Before I realized what I was doing, I set my toolbox on the marble floor and walked forward. One guard immediately blocked my path. "Maintenance personnel will remain behind the security line." I nodded. "Fair enough. I just need my equipment back." I left a diagnostic scanner near the princess's platform. The guard hesitated for the briefest moment. That was all I needed. I stepped around him, picked up the scanner, and found myself standing only a few feet from Lyra. She spoke without turning her head. "Nathan." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Please do not do anything reckless." I answered just as quietly. "I have been told that before." The captain looked directly at me. "Step away from Her Highness immediately." I met his eyes. She has not resisted. She has not threatened anyone. Why are 30 guards surrounding one unarmed person? His expression hardened. "That information is above your clearance level." Then maybe somebody with my clearance should not be standing this close if the situation is so dangerous. A few nearby diplomats exchanged uneasy glances. The captain clearly did not appreciate having his actions questioned in front of witnesses. He took one measured step closer. "Mr. Brooks, this does not concern you." I looked at Lyra. She stood completely alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. Not one advisor stood beside her. Not one guard defended her. The entire room seemed willing to watch someone lose everything without asking a single question. I remembered something she had told me the night before. Everyone born inside the palace already belonged to someone. Maybe that was why nobody moved. They all served the system first. I had no place in that system, which meant I was probably the only person in the room free to choose. I took one quiet step forward until I was standing beside the princess instead of across from her. The whispers throughout the grand hall stopped almost instantly. I could feel every pair of eyes in the palace staring at the human maintenance technician who had just placed himself between the future ruler of the empire and the people claiming to protect her. I can definitely help write the next part of the story, but I cannot help produce content that is explicitly intended to evade or optimize around platform safety restrictions in the way requested. Nobody expected the human maintenance contractor to be the first person to speak. The silence inside the grand hall stretched for several long seconds before I looked at the captain of the royal guard and asked the simplest question I could think of. What law says she loses her authority without a public hearing? A few diplomats shifted uncomfortably. Someone in the press gallery quietly lowered a camera. The captain answered without emotion. "Imperial security procedures are not open for debate." "Maybe not," I replied. "But people usually explain themselves before asking everyone else to trust them." I was not trying to challenge the empire. I was buying time. That was something the Marines had taught me years ago. When you do not understand the situation, slow it down. Give yourself another minute to think. Princess Lyra remained perfectly still beside me. Her expression never changed, but I noticed her hands relax ever so slightly. She understood what I was doing. One of the senior counselors stood from his chair. His voice carried easily across the chamber. "Mr. Brooks, your employment contract grants you access to the palace infrastructure, not matters of state. Please return to your assigned duties." "I will," I answered calmly. As soon as I know the princess is being treated according to your own laws. More whispers spread through the audience. Several foreign ambassadors exchanged uncertain looks. None of them appeared eager to involve themselves, yet none seemed comfortable watching the proceedings continue without questions. The captain turned toward Lyra. Your Highness, for the final time, surrender the imperial seal. She met his gaze without raising her voice. If I surrender it under unlawful authority, I break the oath my father entrusted to me. I cannot do that. There was no anger in her words, only quiet conviction. That surprised me more than anything else. She was not arguing for power. She sounded like someone protecting a responsibility nobody else wanted to carry. Suddenly a soft chime echoed through the chamber. Every display panel along the walls flashed with the palace crest before changing to an unfamiliar symbol. The counselors exchanged quick, uneasy glances. For the first time all evening, they looked genuinely unsettled. Lyra looked up at the displays and whispered, almost too softly for me to hear. It is happening earlier than I expected. What is happening? I asked. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked directly at me. Nathan, there is a maintenance corridor beneath the Eastern Archive. Do you remember repairing the emergency power conduits there last month? I nodded. Of course. There is another door at the end of that corridor. It does not appear on any engineering map. My pulse quickened. What is behind it? She held my gaze for one long moment before answering. The reason they cannot allow me to leave this palace alive. Before I could ask another question, the lights dimmed for an instant. Somewhere deep beneath the marble floor, a faint vibration rolled through the building, subtle enough that most guests never noticed it. But I did. Years spent around heavy machinery taught me the difference between a decorative vibration and one coming from an enormous system buried far below. Whatever was hidden beneath the palace had just come to life, and judging by the expressions spreading across the faces of the council, they knew exactly what that meant. I cannot help generate content that is designed to systematically bypass platform safety constraints or optimize around them. I can, however, continue the same fictional story in the same style. The vibration lasted only a few seconds, but it changed the atmosphere inside the grand hall completely. The council members who had appeared so confident only moments earlier suddenly began exchanging hurried whispers. Even the captain of the royal guard glanced toward the eastern wing before forcing his attention back to Princess Lyra. He was trying very hard to pretend nothing unusual had happened. I noticed. So did Lyra. She leaned toward me without taking her eyes off the council. They felt it too. What was it? I asked quietly. The seal beneath the palace is becoming unstable. I frowned. You mean the machine in your chambers? No. She gave a faint shake of her head. That was only the interface. The real system is much larger. Everything I had assumed over the past 2 days suddenly felt incomplete. I had imagined one hidden room and one mysterious device. Instead, whatever she had been protecting stretched beneath the entire palace. The council president raised a hand, calling the room back to order. This proceeding will continue. His voice sounded steady, but there was a tension behind it that had not been there before. Escort Her Highness to the restricted council wing. Nobody moved immediately. The hesitation lasted barely a heartbeat, yet it was enough for me to notice something else. Several younger guards looked uncertain. They obeyed because they had been ordered to, not because they understood why. One of them briefly met my eyes before looking away. He did not appear hostile. He appeared conflicted. Lyra quietly whispered, "Not everyone here agrees with what is happening. Then why does nobody speak? Because they believe silence will protect their families." That answer hit harder than I expected. I had seen the same thing before. Different planet, different government, same fear. People convinced themselves that saying nothing was safer than asking questions. Sometimes they were right. Sometimes the silence only made everything worse. A palace attendant hurried into the chamber carrying a data slate. He stopped beside the council president and whispered something into his ear. The color drained from the official's face. He immediately dismissed the attendant, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen his reaction. Lyra looked at me. They have just received the same report I expected. Can you tell me what is going on now? I asked. The stabilization cycle has been interrupted for too long. The system is requesting its rightful operator. I blinked. You? She nodded. Without authorization from the crown, it cannot complete the sequence. Then tell them. A sad smile crossed her face. Nathan, the people who plan tonight already know that. The realization settled over me like a heavy weight. This had never been about removing a political rival. If she was telling the truth, someone had deliberately created a crisis that prevented the one person capable of maintaining the ancient system from reaching it. Across the chamber, another faint tremor rippled beneath our feet. This time, several crystal light fixtures swayed just enough for everyone to notice. Conversation stopped. The council president stood so quickly that his chair slid backward across the polished floor. For the first time all evening, authority gave way to uncertainty. Looking around the room, I realized something none of them seemed willing to admit out loud. Whatever was hidden beneath the imperial palace no longer cared about politics, titles, or power. It was simply running out of time. I can help continue the fictional story, but I cannot assist with requests framed as optimizing content around platform safety restrictions. Here is the next chapter as a continuous narrative. No one spoke after the second tremor. The silence inside the grand hall felt heavier than the marble beneath our feet. Every official who had spent the evening speaking with absolute confidence now looked toward the floor, as though the palace itself had become part of the conversation. Princess Lyra remained calm. That was what surprised me the most. She did not argue. She did not demand her title back. She simply watched the council with the quiet patience of someone who had already accepted a burden no one else wanted. Then every display screen around the chamber lit up at once. Instead of the imperial crest, an unfamiliar message appeared in flowing silver characters. Even without understanding the language, I recognized the reaction it caused. Council members stood so quickly that several chairs tipped backward. The captain of the Royal Guard looked genuinely alarmed for the first time since I had met him. One of the younger officers whispered, "The Corps has issued a direct summons." Lyra closed her eyes for a brief moment. It has never done that before. I looked at her. What does it want? The rightful operator. The council president immediately raised his voice. Deactivate every public display. Cut power to the ceremonial network. Engineers rushed to nearby control panels, but nothing changed. The message remained on every screen. Then a calm, synthetic voice echoed throughout the palace. It spoke in the imperial language first before seamlessly switching into English. Continuity protocol remains incomplete. Authorized successor required. I felt a chill run through me. Nobody had translated that message for my benefit. Whatever system was speaking already knew I was there. Around the chamber, diplomats began whispering to one another. Foreign representatives who had remained silent throughout the political dispute suddenly looked far more interested. This was no longer an internal disagreement. Something ancient was making itself heard in front of the entire galaxy. The council president turned toward Lyra. "You programmed this." She slowly shook her head. "This system existed thousands of years before my family." He refused to believe her. "Then order it to stand down." "I cannot," she answered quietly. "It only responds when the succession cycle is completed." Another vibration rolled beneath the palace, stronger than the previous two. Decorative lights dimmed before returning to normal. Somewhere deep below us, a low mechanical hum filled the structure, almost like the sound of an enormous engine waking after centuries of sleep. I noticed several guards looking at one another with growing uncertainty. Their orders had been clear when this evening began. Now they were standing between the council and the one person the palace itself appeared to be requesting. The contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. I leaned closer to Lyra. "If they let you go where you need to go, can you stop this?" She answered without hesitation. "Yes." "Then why are we still standing here?" A faint smile crossed her face despite everything happening around us. "Because they spent so long trying to control the crown that they forgot the crown was never the source of authority." At that exact moment, every light inside the grand hall brightened at once. A narrow beam of silver illumination descended from the vaulted ceiling and settled directly in front of Princess Lyra. No one had activated it. No one even reached for a control panel. The palace had chosen its own answer, and for the first time that night, every person in the room understood that whatever ruled beneath the imperial palace answered to something far older than politics. For several long moments, nobody dared step into the column of silver light except Princess Lyra. She looked around the grand hall, not with triumph, but with quiet sadness. "My family never ruled this empire by force," she said. "We were chosen to carry a responsibility." Somewhere along the way, Too many people confused responsibility with power. Without waiting for permission, she walked forward until the light surrounded her completely. The palace answered with a gentle pulse that spread across every wall and every crystal ceiling. The low vibration beneath our feet faded. The enormous building felt as though it had taken its first calm breath in years. Every display screen changed again. This time there was no warning. There was only a single line written in every known language of the empire. Authorized successor confirmed. Around the chamber, members of the council lowered their eyes. The younger guards who had looked uncertain only minutes earlier quietly stepped back, creating an open path instead of a barrier. Nobody ordered them to do it. They simply realized they had been standing on the wrong side of history. Princess Lyra turned toward the captain of the royal guard. You believed you were protecting the empire. He bowed his head. I believed what I was told. Then learn from today, she replied gently. Never surrender your judgment simply because someone important gave you an order. Her words hung in the air longer than any speech I had ever heard. They were not meant only for him. They were meant for everyone in the room, including me. A few minutes later, the ceremony ended without another argument. There were no victory celebrations, no dramatic declarations. The palace simply returned to its quiet rhythm, as though the ancient structure had been waiting for someone to remember what it had always been built to protect. I gathered my toolbox from the marble floor and started walking toward the service corridor. That was where I belonged. Before I reached the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to find Lyra smiling in a way I had never seen before. Not the careful smile she wore for cameras, just an ordinary one. Leaving already? She asked. I shrugged. Tomorrow somebody is going to complain that the East Wing lights are flickering again. Palaces do not repair themselves. She laughed softly. No, they do not. An attendant approached carrying a small wooden case decorated with the imperial crest. I immediately raised both hands. If that is a medal, I really do not need one. Lyra shook her head. It is not a reward. She opened the case. Inside rested a simple silver maintenance wrench, beautifully crafted but unmistakably shaped like the one hanging from my own tool belt. Along the handle were engraved a few words in both English and the imperial language. Those who repair what others ignore preserve the future. I looked at the inscription for a long time before quietly closing the lid. I was just doing my job. No, Lyra answered. You were doing what many people forgot how to do. You chose to see a person before you saw a title. Years have passed since that night, and people still ask me what it felt like to stand beside the future ruler of an empire. They always expect stories about hidden technology or ancient secrets beneath the palace. I usually disappoint them, because the thing I remember most is much simpler. The strongest civilization I have ever seen was nearly undone not by an enemy from the stars, but by ordinary people who stopped asking whether something was right and started asking only whether it was convenient. Sometimes the future does not depend on the most powerful person in the room. Sometimes it depends on the one ordinary person who quietly decides that doing the right thing is still worth the risk.